Welcome back to Who's Worse, where I usually talk about the worst episode of a particular season of Doctor Who. However, not everything has to be negative, so I'm doing something different today. Before I move on to the second Doctor, I want to talk about my favorite episodes from the first Doctor's lineup. A few things to keep in mind though. 1. This is only my opinion. If you want to share your own list, feel free to do so. 2. Expect spoilers. If you haven't seen the first Doctor's adventures and don't want to get spoiled, you might want to catch up. Don't worry, I'll be here when you get back. Hopefully. Now, without any further ado, let's get started. Number 5. In this day and age, we know plenty about the Doctor. He's a renegade Time Lord from Gallifrey who travels through time and space and tries to help wherever he can. Well, provided said help doesn't change history. That's usually a no-no in his book. However, back when the show first started, the Doctor was an enigmatic figure. We didn't know much about him, except that he had a granddaughter, traveled through time and space in his own machine called the TARDIS, and was vehemently against people changing history. But then a serial from the end of Season 2 changed things. In the show's first pseudo-historical, The Time Meddler, the Doctor pays a visit to England in the year 1066, where he encounters a man simply called the Monk. At first, he seems to be a suspicious sort of man. In fairness, anyone from the 11th century who saw a police box would act that way. Right when the first episode ends, however, you can tell that something isn't right about him. Must be the evil laughter. As the serial progresses, we learn a bit more about him and what he's doing, culminating in a surprising reveal. The Monk has a TARDIS of his own. No longer was the TARDIS unique to the Doctor. Instead, TARDISes seemed to be common among the Doctor's people. Alongside that is the implication that anyone with a TARDIS could decide to interfere with history, which should make everyone thankful that the Doctor isn't that kind of person. Usually. There's a lot that the serial does when it comes to expanding the show's lore, but there's plenty of other moments to enjoy as well. The plot is really solid. It takes place around the time a Viking invasion is set to occur, something that's a part of the Monk's plans. There's also a beautiful musical score, great set designs, and even some comedic bits here and there.
Well, there you are, young man. What do you think of that now, eh? A Viking helmet.
Maybe.
What do you mean, maybe? What do you think it is, a space helmet for a cow?
This also marked the debut of Stephen Taylor as a companion. While he appeared during the final episode of The Chase, he didn't join the Doctor's travels until this story. As I've said in the past, he's among my favorite companions thus far, and the chemistry between him and Vicky is great. A shame that this is the only surviving story with them interacting together. And even though he acts like a bit of a prick, who can blame him after what he's gone through, that part of him is overshadowed by his resourcefulness and snark. Seriously, listen to some of his lines.
It stands for time and relative dimensions in space.
IDBI.
Yeah.
Means I don't believe it.
This serial has plenty to offer, and deserves to be called an important story because of the ramifications it presents. While it's overshadowed by the other stories on this list, this one more than deserves its spot here. Number 4. As I've explained, the Doctor typically has issues with people trying to change history, and those feelings were made evident back in Season 1. This time, however, the person who wanted to change history was one of his companions. And how did she go about this? By pretending to be a reincarnation of an Aztec priest, of course! You can probably guess how well this ends. While it's the show's second historical serial, the Aztecs is the first known to survive, since Marco Polo is still missing. This story involves the Doctor and company arriving in 15th century Mexico, where they encounter the titular Aztecs. However, one of the companions is believed to be a reincarnation of Yetaxa, since they arrived in his resting place. Using her newfound position, Barbara decides to put an end to the practice of human sacrifice. This doesn't go over well with several people, including the main villain Tlatoxel, who decides to expose Barbara as a fraud. One of this serial's biggest strengths is its interesting cast. There's Kameka, an older woman who gets engaged to the Doctor, and it's as hilarious as it sounds. Otlok, another priest who has his own hang-ups with human sacrifice, allowing him to connect with Barbara, and the main villain himself, Tlatoxel. The thing about him is that he's in the right here. Some random person appears claiming to be a reincarnation of a high priest and tries to put an end to something that's a part of Aztec society. Can anyone blame him for deciding that this person is faking her godhood? Mind you, he does perform some drastic actions that are befitting of a villain, but otherwise what he does makes sense. It probably helps that Tlatoxel is an absolute joy to watch.
No, this is not Yetaxa. This is a false goddess. I will destroy her.
The story itself is another high point. In general, it has a dark tone, as it plays the idea of human sacrifice completely straight, and brings up the idea of changing history. Given the nature of this show, it would have happened eventually, but the conflict occurs between two of the main characters, rather than a protagonist and a villain. Barbara thinks she can save the Aztecs from their eventual destruction, but the Doctor is firmly against her plans.
If I could start the destruction of everything that's evil here, then everything that is good would survive when Cortez lands.
You can't rewrite history. Not one line.
It asks the question of whether or not history can and should be changed, something that future stories will explore. And if you think Barbara's the only character who goes through the ringer, think again. The others get their own issues to sort out, like Ian being forced to fight for his life, or the Doctor poisoning someone, or Susan getting thrown into an arranged marriage. Everyone gets a chance to do something here, a trait some of the other serials lack. It isn't completely dark, as there are a few lighthearted moments sprinkled in, such as the aforementioned proposal. They last long enough to bring some levity to the episode, but not long enough for them to clash with the general tone. In short, if you're a fan of the darker side of the show, this serial is right up your alley. Number 3. As everyone is likely aware of by now, Doctor Who was hit hard by the BBC's junking policy. To this day, 97 episodes are still missing, leaving some serials incomplete and others completely lost. This policy didn't stop until 1978, but its end saved a serial from a destruction that would have occurred otherwise. A serial that didn't just leave a mark on the series, no-ho-ho, it left a smoldering crater. And to think, it was only the show's second serial. That's right, I'm talking about the Daleks, the story that introduced everyone's favorite killer pepperpots. After escaping the cavemen from the previous story, the Doctor and company arrive on the planet Skaro, which is still suffering from the effects of a war. However, in the biggest mistake the Doctor will ever make, he tampers with the TARDIS so that they would have to explore the nearby city. End result, they encounter the Daleks. Oh, and they almost die from radiation poisoning because no one checked the meter in the TARDIS. Like the previous story, this one has a dark tone, because between the radiation, the Daleks, and the other threats the planet throws at them, the crew is constantly in danger. Their only allies are the Thals, a pacifist race that wants to avoid another war. But with how the Daleks behave, it's only a matter of time before pacifism becomes a non-option. There's also a lot of creepy moments, from Barbara wandering around in the cramped hallways of the city to the ambiance of the forest that the group wanders through later on. The two crowning moments, however, have to do with how the audience barely sees the threat in question. First, after the TARDIS crew captures a Dalek, Ian removes what's inside and puts it under a cloak. We never see what it looks like, but given Ian's reaction and the claw that emerges from under the cloak, we can assume it's not a pretty sight. We do see what a Dalek looks like in later serials, though. The other moment happens during an expedition in the forest. One of the Thals leaves to refill some water bags, but he's caught by something in the lake. Like the previous example, we never see the creature, but unlike the Daleks, we don't receive any hint as to what it could look like, leaving it to the audience's imagination. Let's actually talk about the Daleks, shall we? I can only imagine how people watching this in the 60s reacted to seeing these creatures for the first time. Their design is simple. It's an eye stalk and a plunger attached to a pepper pot. And yet it's effective. These things are the stuff of nightmares for many people. Is it because of how inhuman they look? Is it because they want to kill off the Thals in order to survive? Is it because of their weapon that can and will kill you in one shot? Well, unless they have a use for you, then they'll just paralyze you. They're so notorious, all someone has to do is say one word, just one, to get people to think about them.
Exterminate them! Exterminate!
Oh, and it gets worse. Pretty much every Dalek story that follows this one wouldn't have happened if the Doctor didn't decide to explore the city. Nice going, Doctor. Now all of your incarnations get to deal with the Daleks at some point. Like the Time Meddler, this serial is important when it comes to the mythos of the show. And if you want to see how the Daleks became the infamous monstrosities they are today, look no further. Number 2. One thing someone new to the show has to learn is that companions come and go. Inevitably, they will leave the Doctor and, barring a few guest appearances, cameos, or Easter eggs, are never heard from again. Not even Susan was immune to this, as she left early on in Season 2. The story immediately after her departure deals with the aftermath, as the Doctor absently calls for Susan, not realizing that she's gone. But don't worry, because he and the others are about to perform a rescue! Because the serial happens to be called The Rescue. I tried. In this serial, the TARDIS lands on the planet Dido, where two people, Bennett and Vicky, are waiting for a rescue ship to come and pick them up. However, while they're waiting, they have to deal with a creature named Coquillion, an insect-like being who wields a powerful weapon. This is the serial that introduces Vicky, another one of my favorite companions thus far. Throughout the serial, it becomes apparent that she isn't in the best mental state, thanks to Coquillion's machinations. With how she behaves later on in the series, I can't help but wonder if a good chunk of it came from being stranded on Dido. Before watching the serial, I had a vague recollection of her and thought she was the companion I really hated. However, Vicky grew on me rather quickly, unlike her eventual replacement, Dodo. I still want to punch her in the face. As for Coquillion, well, it'd be wrong to call him that. Coquillion is merely a costume that the real villain, Bennett, wears. Though it is a cool costume. However, with or without the costume, Bennett is an utter monster. Prior to the story, he killed one crewman, then arranged to murder the rest of them in an explosion, which wiped out the population of Dido in the process. All without a shred of remorse.
You destroyed a whole planet to save your own skin. You're insane.
Even worse, he's manipulating Vicky, who's unaware of his crimes. The most horrifying thing about him is that he isn't someone on par with the Daleks or the Cybermen in terms of power. He's just a human being. Let's move on to something a bit more happy, like the interactions between the crew and Vicky. For example, when Ian and Barbara talk to Vicky, she learns that they left Earth in 1963. She goes on to say this.
But that means you're about 550 years old.
Ian has a good laugh about it, and I couldn't help but laugh with him. Though that's not to say all of their interactions were full of laughs. Prior to that, Vicky yelled at them for trying to ruin her chance to escape from Coquillion. Thankfully, the Doctor manages to talk her down. Speaking of the Doctor, he's come a long way since he kidnapped Ian and Barbara. While he's performed some heroic deeds in the past, this story has him inviting Vicky to travel with him. It's also during this serial where we realize that angering him is a bad idea. After he confronts Bennett about his crimes, he attempts to blindside him with his weapon. Mind you, it almost ends poorly for him, but at least he tried. It's a short serial that wraps up nicely, and I distinctly remember wanting to watch the serial immediately following this one, called The Romans. My advice? Don't do it. These two are so different you'll end up getting whiplash. Now before I get to number 1, let's talk about some honorable mentions. There's a lot to like about the Reign of Terror. It has a dark story, the Doctor going out of his way to save his companions from their imprisonment, quite a few continuity nods, and the costumes, especially the one the Doctor wears. Oh Lord, that's magnificent. On the other hand, there are noticeable flaws that keep it from getting any higher on this list. Susan and Barbara act like idiots numerous times, with the latter believing that medicine from this era can help Susan when she comes down with an illness. You're a history teacher, you should know better! There's also the animation used for episodes 4 and 5. At times it's passable, but when the 3D faces show up, it looks horrid. I'd rather watch the stiff animation from the power of the Daleks than see those faces again. And like many serials, it's 6 episodes long, but it doesn't feel like it makes use of them. It's one of those serials that should have been cut down to 4 episodes. Still, with all of its flaws, I found myself enjoying it. Probably because I'm a fan of historical periods like the Reign of Terror. I would suggest watching this with caution. I know I reviewed this for the Season 4 edition of Who's Worse, but like I said in that episode, I had to review this because the Underwater Menace was incomplete. This serial's biggest flaw is that, other than 2 moments, there's nothing noteworthy about it. It's a typical base under siege story that happens to introduce Cybermen and regeneration. I mean, there's more things to like about this than the Reign of Terror. The sets are great and enhance the oppressive atmosphere that emerges once the Cybermen arrive. Cutler is a good anti-villain who can be sympathized with. And the Cybermen look pretty creepy in their first appearance. Like the previous serial, this has an animated episode, but it's considerably better. No 3D faces here! Imagine if we did get that for episode 4. I can't tell if that would make it better or worse. This serial just barely missed out on being in the top 5, just like it barely got out of being what I considered an optional episode. Yes, I rank the episodes I watch. It makes things like this easier. Anyway, as the title implies, the Daleks return to wreak havoc on Earth. And boy do they. When the Doctor and company arrive, they've almost completely dominated the planet. While it starts off slow, the serial picks up at around 2/3 of the way through. We get crowd-surfing Daleks, a budding romance between Susan and a rebel fighter, and some insight on what someone might have to do to survive in this world. Also, Barbara runs over some Daleks with a lorry. Since this will be the last time I get to do this... Truly, she can't be contained. And that's not even her best moment in this serial! Really, everyone gets a chance to shine here, and the last episode is a lot of fun. A word of warning though, if you happen to like Susan, get some tissues ready. You're gonna need them. Number 1! I'm a bit of a sucker for psychological torture. You give me something that horrifies people through the use of psychology, and I'm probably going to like it. Unless everything else sucks, but my point still stands. Doctor Who has no shortage of these sorts of things. With their first Dalek encounter out of the way, there's no way things could get worse for the TARDIS crew, right? Well, the fact that I said that means something really bad is going to happen. But you don't need me to tell you that. An episode title like The Edge of Destruction will do it for me! This is a 2-part serial that takes place entirely in the TARDIS. After everyone is knocked out for a bit, they deal with headaches and bouts of amnesia. However, the TARDIS itself appears to be malfunctioning, leading Susan to suspect that there's a presence aboard the ship. Things spiral downward from there. Let's just say you'll want to keep your scissors locked away after watching this. Like some of the other contenders on this list, it's important to the show's mythos. There's 2 reasons for this. 1, this serial is a major stepping stone in the Doctor's development. The previous 2 serials proved that he was someone who didn't seem to care for anyone besides himself, as he performed questionable actions like kidnapping Ian and Barbara, and forcing everyone to go to the Dalek City. He's still a jackass in this serial, as he's willing to throw the 2 humans out of his ship, where they would likely die. However, after Barbara gives him a well-deserved lecture, and he realizes that she and Ian aren't responsible for the TARDIS's problems, he softens a bit. From here on, the Doctor becomes less of a dick and more like the madman with a box that we all know and love. The second reason is the implication that the TARDIS is alive. All of the malfunctions that occur throughout the story are the machine's way of warning the crew of what's happening. This wouldn't be confirmed until The Doctor's Wife, a story made about 47 years later. What's interesting about this serial is that there isn't a villain. Instead, the main source of tension comes from the crew arguing and threatening each other, and going through bouts of madness. A paranoid Doctor ends up turning against Ian and Barbara, Ian nearly strangles the Doctor and Barbara, and Susan gets the worst of it all. At some points, she looks like she's possessed by some sort of entity.
Can't you see I found you out? Why won't you admit it, hmm?
Why don't you? sir. You've been behaving very strangely.
For a serial that's short, it does a lot with its time, as it explores just how bad things could get if something went wrong with the TARDIS, and allows the crew to not only go through character development, but to grow closer to each other as well. And that's it for this episode. Next time, I'll get back to my regular business and cover what I think is the worst episode of Season 5. Will it feature the Cybermen, the Ice Warriors, or a villainous doppelganger? Well, I can tell you what it won't have: the Great Intelligence. Have you seen the Web of Fear episode 3? People would really appreciate it if it was brought back. Please.